I'm Connor Grohl, and this is Slept on Sports, the podcast that takes interesting, lesser-known sports stories you could say have been slept on, and brings them back into the light. Today, we have 3 stories involving expansion teams. Now, expansion teams are exciting. Anytime a league gets a new franchise, that means a city has a new team to cheer on. There are interesting logo, team name, and branding opportunities, and a whole bunch of players get a chance to play in the big leagues potentially for the first time. It's a lot of fun. However, there's also a flip side to the equation. Expansion teams usually suck. Of the 64 expansion teams in the Big Four North American leagues, the NFL, NBA, MLB, and NHL since 1960, the Las Vegas Golden Knights were the only one to finish with even a winning record in their first season, which made their run to the Stanley Cup Finals all the more impressive. It's usually the good, the bad, and the ugly, but without the good. However, I have managed to find a couple positive stories, and over the course of this episode, we're going to run the whole gamut. First up, we have the story of the only head coach in NBA history to win Coach of the Year while his team had a losing record. This story is about the Chicago Bulls, but the Bulls weren't the first NBA expansion team in Chicago. In 1961, the Chicago Packers joined the NBA as the league's 9th team. Yes, the Chicago Packers, a team bearing the same name as the Chicago Bears' biggest rival in Green Bay. Fans obviously hated the name, and so the following year, the team was renamed to the Chicago Zephyrs. Over their first 2 seasons, the Chicago Packers/Zephyrs were led by Walt Bellamy. But despite Bellamy's greatness, the team struggled to find success, going just 43-117. That following off-season saw the Zephyrs move to Baltimore and rename themselves the Baltimore Bullets. This franchise is currently the Washington Wizards. However, when the NBA expanded to 10 teams before the 1966-67 season, they went right back to Chicago, and the Bulls were born. The head coach of the new Chicago Bulls was Johnny Kerr, nicknamed Red, who had spent the last 12 seasons in the NBA as a player, and coincidentally had come from the Baltimore Bullets. He was actually taken by the Bulls in the expansion draft, but decided instead to retire and become the coach of his hometown team. As a rookie in the NBA, he won the 1955 title with the Syracuse Nationals, before going on to become a 3-time All-Star. When Kerr moved to Chicago, he took Jerry Sloan with him. Sloan had been a rookie with the Bullets the previous season, but would go on to spend the next 10 years as a player for the Chicago Bulls, becoming the first player to have his jersey retired by the team. He would then become the coach of the Bulls, and then, most famously, the coach of the Utah Jazz for more than 2 decades. Sloan was one of the leaders of the inaugural Bulls team, along with Guy Rodgers and Bob Boozer. The team finished with a record of 33-48, and were swept by the St. Louis Hawks in the first round of the playoffs. Still, at the end of the season, Red Kerr was named NBA Coach of the Year. People seem to believe that Kerr won the award because he took the Bulls to the playoffs in their first season as a team. Yet, I take some issue with that. There were only 10 teams in the NBA at the time, and 8 of them made the playoffs. The Bulls finished 4th place out of 5 teams in the West, and had just the 8th best record in the league overall. So yes, they made the playoffs, but they only had to beat 1 team in order to do so, the Detroit Pistons. Then again, to this day, 33 wins is the most ever for an NBA expansion team, so I guess Kerr does have to get some credit. Still, it's really weird to think that the Coach of the Year could have a losing record. Interestingly though, since then, 2 coaches have won Coach of the Year, going just .500. Regardless, Red Kerr won Coach of the Year. although things didn't exactly go great for him in the years to follow. The Bulls went just 29-53 the following season, and at the end of the year, Kerr resigned. He then went to be the first head coach in Phoenix Suns history, but was fired in his second season there. After his coaching career, he became a color commentator for the Bulls for more than 30 years. The Bulls had some good seasons in the early 70s, but were mostly a non-factor until they drafted some guy named Michael Jordan, who changed things just a little bit. But there you go. A second expansion team in Chicago, and a successful first season, at least by expansion team standards. But it didn't go so well for everyone. I mean, that much is obvious. But some expansion teams in their first seasons were really, really terrible. For our second story, I could have decided to talk about the 1960 Dallas Cowboys, who went winless with just one tie in their first season. Doing so would have made me, a Giants fan, very happy. I could have also talked about the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, who lost their first 26 games in franchise history before winning the final 2 games of their second season. But while teams rarely go winless, there are some pretty bad teams in the NFL every year. Usually someone only wins 2 or 3 games. Things are a little bit different in a sport like hockey, where even the worst teams can usually still win a couple dozen games in a season. Horrible performances, particularly on the road, in lengthier inaugural seasons leads us to the 1974-75 Washington Capitals and the 1992-93 Ottawa Senators. We'll start with the Capitals because they came first. Washington joined the NHL along with the Kansas City Scouts at a time when there were already 30 teams between the NHL and the competing World Hockey Association. This made the available talent pool super thin, which wasn't helped by the fact that Russian players were not allowed in the league. The Capitals, with whatever roster they managed to pull together, were flat out awful. Their record of 8 wins, 67 losses, and 5 ties is the worst record in NHL history. But while they were terrible everywhere, the Capitals were especially bad on the road. In fact, they had lost all 37 of their road games ahead of a March 28, 1975 encounter at the California Golden Seals. The Capitals had lost 17 games in a row, home or away, entering the matchup, but somehow emerged victorious with a 5-3 victory. In what has quickly become one of my favorite stories of futility, following the game, the team took a metal garbage can, signed their names on it with a marker, and took turns lifting the can as they skated around the ice. It was their own version of the Stanley Cup. Of course, the team would lose their last 2 road games of the season, making their final road record 1 win and 39 defeats. Over the course of the season, the Capitals scored 181 goals and allowed 446, for a differential of -265. They lost by an average of more than 3 goals per game. That figure, 446 goals allowed, is the most in NHL history. As a team, they conceded 5.58 goals per game. The best of their 3 goalies was Michael Bellemare, but despite a team-best 5.37 goals against average, he went winless, with a record of 24 losses and 3 ties. Over the course of the season, the team lost 4 games by at least 10 goals and used 3 different head coaches. It didn't help that the team's first head coach, Jim Anderson, had 0 NHL coaching experience and was merely a friend of general manager Milt Schmidt. Anderson resigned during the season, as the stress of coaching had left him with stomach ulcers. He also reportedly said during the season, "I'd rather find out my wife was cheating on me than keep losing like this." At least I could tell my wife to cut it out. After Anderson's resignation, George Sullivan took over the team. But later, Milt Schmidt fired him and took over coaching himself. There are so many crazy stats here. Bill Mickelson finished with an all-time record plus-minus of minus 82 while playing in just 59 games. Greg Jolly, another defenseman who was the team's number 1 overall pick in the 1974 draft, did even worse on a per-game basis, finishing minus 69 in 44 games. All in all, the Capitals were a train wreck. They didn't end up reaching the playoffs until their 9th season, at which point no members from the original Capitals remained. The team then won their first title in 2018 against the expansion Vegas Golden Knights. The Senators were even worse on the road. While it took the Capitals 38 games to have their first road victory, the Senators didn't win until their 39th road game, which was a 5-3 win at the Islanders. To recap, the Senators began their franchise's history losing their first 38 games on the road, and for the Capitals, 37. The next longest losing streak on the road to start a season is just 14 games. But things were going poorly for the Senators before they even ever took the ice. The team attempted to make 3 picks on ineligible players during the expansion draft, and when it came time for the actual draft, they spent their first-round pick on Alexei Yashin, who would spend the year in Russia. The Senators actually won their first game in franchise history at home against the Canadiens, but they ended up going winless in their next 21 and finished the year 10 wins, 70 losses, and 4 ties. However, despite the team being terrible, they actually sold out every home game, so props to the fans. It's rare for an expansion team like the Senators to win their first ever game. But for our final story, I want to talk about perhaps the greatest debut in expansion team history. In 1959, Minnesota was awarded one of the initial spots in the American Football League, a new startup set to compete with the NFL. The NFL hadn't planned on expanding at the time, but they didn't want the AFL to start up either. So they approached the ownership groups of all the AFL teams and either offered them a spot in the NFL or an ownership stake in an existing NFL team. Minnesota's ownership group took the NFL up on its offer, and the Minnesota Vikings were born, set to start play in the NFL, not the AFL, in 1961. The team would be coached by Hall of Fame quarterback Norm Van Brocklin, who had actually just led the Eagles to a championship the year before as a player. Van Brocklin retired on top, thinking he could replace the retiring Buck Shaw as the coach of the Eagles. But instead, the team elevated assistant Nick Scorch to the position, leaving Van Brocklin to head to Minnesota. The team's first regular season game came on September 17, 1961, with the Vikings hosting the Chicago Bears. At quarterback, the Vikings started George Shaw, a 6-year veteran who had played most recently with the Giants, and had a career 10-14-2 record in 26 starts. Late in the first quarter, the Vikings found themselves leading 3-0. However, Coach Van Brocklin was dissatisfied with the way his team was moving the ball on offense, leading him to pull Shaw and replace him with the team's third-round draft pick, quarterback Fran Tarkenton out of Georgia. The Bears were only a middle-of-the-road NFL team at this point, but the Vikings were still big 10.5-point underdogs. Most of this is due to how the Vikings roster was constructed. Back then, teams had 40 players on their rosters, and in the expansion draft, each team got to protect 34 of them. This meant that the Vikings had to take 3 of the bottom 6 players from each team, plus whoever they drafted in the actual draft, and turn them into an NFL football team. Yet somehow, at least for just one game, everything came together. In the second quarter, Tarkenton threw the first touchdown pass in Vikings history, a 14-yarder to Bob Schnelker. The Bears then answered, but the Vikings still led 10-6 at the half. But in the second half, the team exploded. Minnesota scored the first 27 points of the second half. 2 more passing touchdowns for Tarkenton in the third, then a rush and another passing touchdown in the fourth, which made the game 37-6. The Vikings would go on to win 37-13. It was 5 total touchdowns off the bench for Tarkenton in not only his first game, but the first game for the entire Minnesota Vikings franchise. His final stat line, 17 of 23 for 250 yards, 4 touchdowns, and no interceptions. He also had 4 rushes for 11 yards and a score. Tarkenton, to this day, remains the only quarterback to throw for 250 yards, 4 touchdowns, and no interceptions in their NFL debut. The Vikings were also the last NFL expansion team to win their first game until the Houston Texans did so in 2002. Mike Ditka also made his NFL debut for the Bears in that game, recording 1 catch for 18 yards. But the day was clearly Tarkenton's. Unfortunately, the Vikings couldn't keep that momentum going forward. The team lost their next 7 games and finished the season just 3-11. Tarkenton also wouldn't throw another touchdown pass until week 8. Although granted, he didn't start every game. But still, it was the beginning of an incredible career for Tarkenton. He would go on to play 6 seasons with the Vikings, then 5 with the New York Giants, and then 7 more seasons with the Vikings. Tarkenton was a 9-time Pro Bowler and the 1975 NFL MVP. When he retired, he was the all-time leader in yards, touchdowns, and interceptions. He's still 11th all-time in touchdowns to this day. In 1986, Tarkenton became the first player to primarily play with the Vikings to be elected to the Pro Football Hall of Fame. And all of that greatness was on full display in his first NFL performance. He also proved that while life as an expansion team can be tough, there's still some fun to be had. I think all of our stories today showed that. Between Tarkenton, Red Kerr winning Coach of the Year, and the Washington Capitals skating around the ice while carrying a signed garbage can. Thanks for listening to another episode of Slept on Sports. I've been Connor Grohl, and as always, stay sleepin'.